The Battle of the Little Bighorn, also frequently referred to as Custer's Last Stand, was fought on June 25, 1876, by the Little Bighorn River in Montana. It was fought by the Lakota, Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes, battling against the men of the 7th Regiment of the U.S. Cavalry. The 7th Regiment of the U.S. Cavalry was led by Commander George Armstrong Custer. George Armstrong Custer was a veteran of the American Civil War. He was an Army officer as well as a cavalry commander in the Civil War. Conveniently enough, he graduated West Point 1861 at the bottom of his class, though since the Civil War was just starting, trained officers were in high demand. Though infamous for being the cavalry commander throughout the Civil War, he had a track record of recklessness with a devious conduct against Native Americans. After the Civil War had ended, more and more land was needed to accommodate American settlers, and as the settlers expanded westward, more and more feuds arose between the American settlers and the Native American tribes. The Great Plains was the last Native American holdout in America at the time, as many settlers did not prefer the dry weather and the vast amount of natives living there. After the Civil War, it became increasingly difficult to find land that was far west, so settlers set their eyes on the Great Plains. Conflict between the Native Americans and the settlers became inevitable. In 1866, Custer started hunting natives with much success as he led a raid against the Cheyenne village. In 1868, the U.S. government had signed the Fort Laramie Treaty, recognizing the South Dakota's Black Hills as part of the Great Sioux Reservation. In 1874, an expedition led by Custer found gold in the Black Hills. The U.S. government had tried to buy the hills off the natives, but the Native Americans refused to sell as they saw the land as being sacred land. Many Native Americans reserved to moving to Montana to settle with Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, who were seen as leaders of the native peoples. All in all, 7,000 natives were settled by the Little Bighorn River, a third of which were capable of fighting. The natives were armed with Winchester, Spencer, and Henry repeating rifles, as well as their traditional bows and tomahawks. Before the battle, it was said that Sitting Bull performed the sun dance. The sun dance is a ritual in which Sitting Bull removes flesh from his body and dances until he sees a vision. After 2 days of the ritual, Sitting Bull saw a vision of a victory in battle. Though, through his premonition, he warned that nothing shall be taken off the enemy, or death and despair would reach the Lakota tribe. The battle started in 1876 within the Great Plains of Montana. The U.S. had 3 separate armies: the Dakota Column, led by General Alfred Terry, who was said to attack from Fort Earham; the Montana Column, led by Colonel John Gibson, who was led to advance on the tribes, and General R. Crook was said to invade from Fort Fetterman. The invasion began with the army under Crook advancing north until he was checked by Chieftain Soki with his army of the Oglala and Cheyenne. General R. Crook was defeated and pushed back on the 17th of June. On the east, Terry would advance, and on the 25th of June, he detached his 7th Cavalry Regiment, led by George Custer, to scout ahead. Custer, though, came up with his own plan to kidnap women and children in order to later exchange them back for the Lakota land. His plan was to launch a 2-pronged attack to capture as many civilians as possible. The battle started when Colonel Reno was ordered to the southern side of the camp. He followed his orders, but instead of capturing civilians like intended, he opened fire on the native people. The natives retaliated with their own cavalry, which made Reno retreat to a nearby tree line, where he was overwhelmed. Meanwhile, Custer had moved his force to the other side of the native camp, where he received news of Reno's situation. Hearing this, he ordered his company of men to attack the northern flank of the camp as a diversion, as he attempted to help Reno. The natives predicted Custer's plans and hid riflemen in the tall grass surrounding the camp. Reno's troops retreated to high ground as Custer's army was getting attacked on the northern side of the camp. Before anyone was able to assist Reno, Custer was forced to retreat to the high ground as well. At this point, Chieftain Suki sent his cavalry northward as Custer and natives were exchanging volleys of gunfire. When the cavalry charge reached Custer, he and his army was killed. The native army moved westward to attack Reno and his men, but Reno was able to dig in and survive until 9 p.m. when reinforcements arrived under Marshal Benteen. All in all, Custer's army had lost 268 soldiers, whilst only 145 natives' lives were lost, 10 of which being civilians. After the battle, all of Custer's men were looted and in some cases dismembered. According to Sitting Bull himself, the battle is seen as a victory for the natives as they killed one of the most notorious commanders of the Civil War. But in reality, it was a lose-lose situation as their victory only outraged white Americans, and it would only increase their pre-existing perception of natives as bloodthirsty savages. The U.S. loss at the Battle of the Little Bighorn only made it so the government would increase their efforts to subdue the native tribes. They retaliated against the natives, and they saw every native that was not part of a reservation as a threat. They slaughtered buffalo in order to force natives into reservations, and they attacked villages, killed horses, and took innocent lives. In other words, before the battle, the U.S. populace saw the Native Americans as below them and more of a nuisance that was out west, and they didn't really see them as much of a threat. But after they read in the papers that the natives mutilated and killed Custer and all of his men, they changed their mindsets on the natives, and since there were no survivors to tell the tales of the battle, the papers created their own version of events which greatly exaggerated what happened in the battle to get more of a reaction out of the citizens. The paper made Custer the hero of every story, and they portrayed him as a legend who fought to the death. After the loss at the Little Bighorn, Lieutenant General Phil Sheridan deployed 2,500 additional troops to avenge the death of Custer. Congress took away the Black Hills in violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty and seized another 40 million acres of promised land. Sitting Bull, however, refused to accept defeat. The increased effort by the U.S. government to subdue the natives made it so that within almost 5 years, almost all Sioux and Cheyenne tribes would be moved to reserve. Sitting Bull and his loyalists fled to Canada, and he was followed by General Terry, who traveled north to offer Sitting Bull a pardon in exchange for settling in a reservation, which Sitting Bull, of course, declined. With buffalo herds dwindling, the U.S. Army had a plan of starving natives into reservations by slaughtering buffalo into near extinction. This worked and led Sitting Bull out of his exile. He was assigned to the Standing Rock Agency in 1883. Sitting Bull lived in a cabin. He devoted his life to his family, and he retained 2 wives, 2 adult daughters who were married and had grandchildren. The government agent James McClellan permitted Sitting Bull to participate in a traveling exhibition in 1884 and in 1885. The legendary figure was allowed to join Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, earning $50 a week and appearing on horseback in an arena. On tour, he profited from the sale of photographs, pictures, and he stayed in the show for only 4 months, having the opportunity to shake hands with President Grover Cleveland whilst in Washington, D.C. After returning home, Sitting Bull spoke against the unjust policies of the agency. He openly defied the land agreements of 1888 and 1889, which threw half of the Great Sioux Reservation open to non-Indian settlement and divided the rest into 6 separate reservations. "I'd rather die an Indian than live as a white man," he said, as at the time the U.S. government was changing kids into a more white way of life. They were being taught in white schools, they were prohibited from speaking their native languages, and they were being dressed up the same way as white kids would dress. Sitting Bull died on the last day of the Sioux resistance to U.S. colonialism. U.S. agents suspected that Sitting Bull was planning to go back into exile in Canada. When he was confronted about this, things took a turn for the worse, and Sitting Bull, his teenage son, and 14 other natives were killed in the bout. Alas, the Battle of the Little Bighorn will go down as history as one of the greatest native victories, but their victory came at a steep cost as the retaliation of the U.S. government will only worsen the lives of countless natives.